There is a setting that most mice have turned it on by default, and it's been adding delay to your aim since the day you plugged it in. And that's just one of the 5 layers sitting between your hand and your game that most players have never touched. And I went through all of them on over 40 mice. What costs you real millisecond, what changes the feel, and what's just noise. So in this video we'll go through your sensor settings, your Windows config, and cheap physical upgrades that change how your mouse feels entirely. And first I'm going to talk about motion sync. Your sensor captures movement thousands of times per second, but your USB pulls the mouse separately at whatever hertz you're set. Now what motion sync does is tell the sensors to wait until right before the next USB poll. Now this sounds like a good idea, but that wait costs you time. At 1000 Hz you're adding roughly half of a millisecond to every single packet, and at that polling rate it stacks on top of everything else in your chain. At 4000 Hz it drops to 0.125 milliseconds, which is basically nothing, but most of you are still on 1000 Hz where it actually matters. Now on newer sensors like PAW 3950 and Razer's Focus Pro, the penalty is reportedly much smaller than on older implementations. Razer, for example, has motion sync baked into the firmware with no toggle, but their implementation is actually one of the better ones, so it's less of an issue here. Where it gets problematic is budget and mid-range mice that also force motion sync on, but the feel still changes regardless of implementation. Most top aimers keep it off when they can. Now even with motion sync sorted, if your DPI is still sitting at 400, you're losing real delay during slow tracking, because at 400 DPI the sensor needs way more physical movement before it sends a single count to your PC. I looked at multiple end-to-end latency tests and averaged the result. Mouse movement all the way to pixel change on the screen is roughly 5 millisecond less delay when you go from 400 dpi to 1600 dpi, of course during like slow tracking. So what I would recommend here is 1600 dpi. As for polling rate, I already made a full video on why 8000 Hz doesn't make sense for 99% of people, so basically the short version, 2000 Hz is the sweet spot for most setups. But even with the DPI and motion sync sorted, there's a mode inside your mouse that most people have never touched, and it just changes how the sensor communicates with your PC. So most wireless mice have a power saving built into the firmware. When you're not moving the mouse, the sensor goes into a low power sleep to save battery. Makes sense for battery life, but when you hold an angle and then make a micro adjustment, the sensor has to wake up first. Now depending on the mouse and how long you've been still, the wake up takes anywhere from a few milliseconds to over 10 milliseconds, and it happens on the exact type of movement where you need zero delay. Now competition mode fixes this by doing two things. It keeps the sensor fully awake at all times, and it tightens the SPI bus timing, which is basically how fast the sensor sends data to the brain of the mouse. Think of it like this. Normally the sensor and the MCU are having a slow conversation to save energy, and the competition mode makes them talk as fast as possible. And when competition mode is running with a tighter SPI timing, motion sync becomes mostly pointless. Now tight SPI already keeps the data fresh on its own. Competition mode on and motion sync off basically. That's the combination and is the cleanest signal your mouse can give to you. Now battery life roughly halves though, so for casual play just leave it off. So your mouse is now giving you a clean data, but all of it goes through your Windows before it reaches your game in the first place. So let's talk also about Windows settings. Now first one, it's enhanced pointer precision. That's Microsoft name for mouse acceleration basically. And what it does is change how far your cursor moves based on how fast you move your hand. Move slow and the cursor travels less than you'd expect. Move fast and it overshoots. So go to setting, Bluetooth and device, mouse, additional mouse options, and click on pointer option tab, and of course uncheck it. And while you're on the same tab, set pointer speed to 10 out of 20 in Windows. That's the same as 6 out of 11 if you go through the control panel option. That's the only position that applies zero Windows scaling basically. Above or below it, and Windows adds a multiplier even with acceleration off. Now even with acceleration unchecked, Windows still has hidden legacy thresholds sitting in the registry. 3 values basically: mouse speed, mouse threshold 1, and mouse threshold 2. Open regedit, search for them, set all 3 to 0 and restart. That kills any subtle acceleration curve that stays active even with the checkbox off. Now if you wonder about raw inputs, CS2 and Valorant have removed the toggle entirely. It's forced on basically on a lot of new games. But for some games like Fortnite and Marvel Rivals, you still have the option, so check each game you play and make sure it's enabled. And one more Windows thing you'll see a lot of people arguing about online is game mode. Every optimization guide has a different opinion on this, and the reason it comes up is because Windows has a bunch like background processes that can cause micro CPU spikes while you're playing, and game mode just tells Windows to stop doing that stuff while a game is running. So Windows is clean now, but there are still a lot of settings inside the mouse itself that most people have never changed from default. So let's start first with angle snapping. Just basically turn it off. And what it does is force your cursor into straight lines. You try to flick maybe to a head that's slightly above your crosshair level, and angle snapping corrects your path to perfect horizontal, so you kinda miss. Next you have ripple control, also off. This smooths out your cursor movement at high DPI by altering your raw input. At the 800 to 1600 DPI range, your tracking is already clean on any modern sensor, so just turn it off. Next we have lift off distance. Now set this to the lowest option your mouse offers. Usually it's like 1 mm on new sensor. sensors. So basically what it does is every time you lift your mouse to reposition, any tracking that happens during that lift creates cursor drift. Now lift off distance cause tracking the instant you lift so your crosshair stays exactly where you left it. If you're on a glass pad, don't go below 1 mm or medium in your software. Some pads might have problem with lift off distance, so make sure you test it out before you just blame the mouse or even the pad. Next we have the bounce. This is the delay between your physical click and when the firmware registers it. If you have like optical switches, set it to 0. Now for some mechanical switches I would recommend to stay between 2 and 4 milliseconds. Some of these older mechanical switches will have a bunch of problems with double clicking, so make sure you don't really mess up these things. Now the last one and the most underrated is sensor tilt angle. Nobody holds a mouse perfectly straight. Your natural grip creates a slight angle, usually around 5 to 8 degrees off center, but the sensor is mounted at 0 degrees inside the mouse. So when you move your hand in what feels like a straight horizontal line, the sensor reads it at slightly diagonal, and you get this subtle vertical drift that you've been unconsciously compensating for your entire gaming life. Now I noticed this myself when I actually calibrated mine for the first time. My horizontal lines were consistently off by about 6 degrees. Now after correcting it for the first few days it feels terrible, because your brain has to stop compensating for something it learned to ignore. But usually after a week my horizontal tracking was clearer than it ever was. Of course I still prefer to go back to default since I switch mice a lot and the setting is not the same on every mouse. So if you're sure you're gonna main a mouse for long, you can test this out. Calibrate it, give it 3 to 7 days and you'll feel the difference. And here on the screen you have a full summary of the best settings from what I've seen pro aimers use and also from my own testings. So everything software side is done. Now the physical stuff. Mouse skates first. I've tested a lot of mice at this point and I still haven't found one where I kept the stock fit on. So I would just recommend to look at aftermarket skates. Something like X-ray Obsidians for like glass pads, or even like something that was perfectly cut out for your specific mouse. Next we have grip tape, again aftermarket only. What most brands include in the box is so slippery like it's worse than the bare coating of the mouse. And if you're still on a wired mouse, get a paracord cable and a mouse bungee. And if you like rich and have like access to a 3D printer, you can also mod your mouse by getting lighter bottoms or even like full shells. Or if you're not like that, just buy them directly from some site. So here's how to use everything we covered today. 3 rules depending on what you're dealing with. If your aim feels floaty or swimmy and you can figure out why, check motion sync, check your DPI, check if competition mode is on. That combination alone fixes the feel for most people. If your aim feels inconsistent from session to session, like some days it's great and other days everything is off, check your window settings, check your surface and calibrate your sensor tilt. If your mouse physically feels wrong in your hand, like the glide is scratchy and your grip slips or the cable drags a lot, again, skates, grip dates, lift off distance. Cheapest fixes, biggest difference in how it feels. So now drop your mouse and current DPI settings and whether motion sync is on or off in the comments. I'll tell you which one to fix first, and if you want to learn even more about setup optimizations, check out the next video.